Greetings and welcome to Dialogue of Civilisations. From the early days of American exceptionalism to the Trumpian age of trade wars and pledge to forge the most dominant civilization ever to exist on the face of this earth, the United States has, for the most part of its history, with the exception of the past 2 or so decades, been a power constantly growing in stature and importance. In its 250-year history, this nation has faced many challenges and rivals stronger than itself. For instance, throughout the 19th century, it was patiently waiting in some semi-self-isolation for its moment of glory to come. The age of Pax Britannica, the century between 1815 and the beginning of the First World War, saw Britain rule the waves and control an empire upon which the sun never set, which at its territorial peak covered approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and governed 1/5 of its population. With two great wars of the 20th century taking a heavy toll on Britain and its empire, it eventually lost economic prominence to the United States, giving rise to the Pax Americana age, with the year of 1945 regarded as its inception. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, America, very much like Britain in 1815, found itself as the world's only superpower. This domination has not gone uncontested. China's rise as an economic superpower that rivals the United States in many ways is what appears to prey upon the minds of American policymakers and the current administration in Washington, D.C. During his inauguration address made in January of this year, President Donald Trump stated that America would reclaim its rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, most respected nation on earth, somewhat hinting at America having already lost its central role on the world stage. In fact, all claimants of the highest place in the hierarchy of civilization forces, with practically no exception, have always perceived and portrayed themselves as superior to others. China is no different in this particular respect. Officials from this country quite often use the argument that China represents a 5,000-year-old civilization and therefore is above Trumpian trade threats, which are ephemeral in the grand scheme of clash, or for our purpose, dialogue of civilizations. And today we will try to understand America's new quest for greatness and absolute superiority and try to establish if the United States still perceives itself a force for good. And today I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to converse with John Kavulich. For over 15 years, John has served as senior editor for outcome modeling analysis at Issue Insight, based in Washington, D.C. As a seasoned political analyst, he has traveled to more than 130 countries. He was in Kharkiv on the 24th of February 2022 as the conflict began, and has since made frequent trips across Ukraine, Russia and Belarus, remaining one of the few Western experts with consistent, unrestricted access to all three countries. John, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to converse with you face to face. Before I interviewed you on a number of occasions, I would like to begin our conversation with reference to Donald Trump's statement made in early March. He said that the US will forge the greatest, most dominant, dynamic civilization ever to exist on the face of the earth. Beyond the rhetoric, what are the key components of the major credentials of this claim?
For President Trump, he's very transparent, and oftentimes people make a mistake in trying to look too deeply and dig too deeply when it's quite shallow. Where he talks about U.S. exceptionalism and U.S. dominance, he's very simple in his message, which is, we're going to do what we're going to do, and you're going to come along. And if you don't come along, we're going to bulldoze you. And so where he was talking about the use of force for good, or the use of force for a benefit, or he just talks about what he means, using force. And it's coercive, it's bullying, and it's very important that all governments, heads of state and heads of government, understand that for him, it is simply a matter of winning and losing. He's the winner, they're the loser, and when they do lose, they need to make certain that they tell everybody.
So they have to acknowledge their defeat openly.
Yes.
And how different is this model to the proposition centered around might is right, Is it any way different to that proposition?
It's just simply phraseology. Donald Trump believes that if he has an idea and he believes that it's a good idea, and people around him, who are generally around him because they either agree with him or they want to agree with him, or they know that for their position it's good to agree with him, and they will reinforce that, yes, Greenland should be a part of the United States. Yes, the Panama Canal is at risk. Yes, other territories should be up for grabs. And he looks at that and says yes, and if someone pushes back, from his standpoint, he can't be seen as weak, so he'll just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Eventually, he may not get what he wants, but for him, he will just transition out of it. And that's been one of the most, they used to call President Reagan, Teflon Ron. And one of the most interesting characteristics of President Trump is that if he decides he's not going to do something anymore, he just pivots. And if someone says, well, wait a minute, what about that you were talking about you were going to do? No, fake news, something different. Tariffs, I'm not going to have any deviation from the tariffs. These are deviations. Well, no, they're not deviations, they're something else.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, of course, we are focusing on Trump's personality, and there's another question to what extent these characteristics of Trump could actually go beyond his personality and his immediate surrounding and become a nationwide phenomenon. But also, US in many ways, as I made clear during my introduction, was established as a superpower in many ways in 1945. And Winston Churchill, while reflecting on the transition of global leadership from Britain, from the British Empire to the United States, said that, I quote, that US stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power back in 1945. It's a young, vigorous body, and US is the heir to the British Empire in the same way as a young man inherits the estate of his father. He apologized for this unfortunate metaphor, of course, later. But the question here is that, assuming that United States of America, at the beginning of the Pax Americana age, inherited certain qualities, attributes from the British Empire, first of all, what are those qualities? Are they still with US under Trump?
Well, the qualities were always thought to believe that we are welcoming for all. We are the democracy. We are the example for everyone. We're the pillar of freedom. We acknowledge our faults, and we try to learn from mistakes. President Trump looks at the United States as having been beaten down since 1945 by a successive number of presidents in both parties, but that it has not captured and recaptured its proper place as the singular superpower. And he looks at what his predecessors have done, particularly the last 20 years, as basically a destructive force, ideologically, militarily, geographically, financially, commercially, politically, socially, that we are not what we have the capacity, what we were and what we have the capacity to be. The challenge there is that other countries hear that, and they basically see a bully who's got the world's largest economy, who has an ability to sanction other countries, and it's incredibly disturbing, unnerving, and unsettling.
English philosopher John Lucas once said that future historians will note that the single most important fact about America of the first half of the 20th century is that Americans speak English. And then he added that probably the second important factor to be borne in mind is that another important factor about US is that in terms of its confrontation with Soviet Union is that Russians are white. This is the most important fact of the second half of the 20th century. And then William Buckley described this as a form of reductionism. and then asking this question, to what extent Britain is as dead as she is supposed to be. My question to you, what is, of course I'm going to engage in reductionism as well, and I confess that that's what I'm going to do now. What is the most important fact about America when you take into account the last 3 decades?
It's supposed to have been, we're reasonable and we're rational. And we recognize our limitations, and we put a brake on limitations where we don't need to. But we know when to say no, we know when to say yes, and sometimes saying no is a sign of strength rather than weakness. President Trump has rebalanced, recalculated, reformatted, reformulated how we stack, how we rank 1 to 10, what we're supposed to be doing, who we are. And from his perspective, and his red hat says it all, make America great again, that he looks at America as not what it should be. And he is the only one, as he said in his inaugural first time around, now, I'm the only one that can change it. So it's very personal. You know, you look at World War II, where the UK people personalized Winston Churchill as he was the one that was going to save us. He was going to bring us out of this. We're not at war in that regard, and we've never been attacked as a country. And that, in some respects, that makes us weak, because we don't have the experience of having another country roll through us to try to get it to either take us over, or except when we go back to the UK, it's still, you go back to the Revolutionary War. But I'm saying in the 20th, 21st century, particularly 21st century, where it's all can be captured on someone's cell phone, we don't have that experience. And a lot comes from those experiences. We come at it from experience of beginning 20th, 21st century at the top of the mountain, rather than climbing our way up. And everyone else is underneath us. And that's how he looks at today, that we are the Mount Everest of countries. Everyone else is underneath. And how far up the mountain they come is going to be at our discretion. And how long they stay there is going to be at our discretion.
It's very interesting that many analysts, historians, used to say one very definably positive thing about the United States, that the United States, together with its allies, created a certain system wherein there is an element of competition. And this competition is fair, balanced. There are certain rules designed by the United States of America for its own interest, of course, but still. And what happened very lately is that the US is not in a position to compete within the framework of a system that it has created. Therefore, under Trump, it wants to change the rules of the game. Effectively, China is defeating US in certain respects within the framework of the game created by the United States. And the principles changed quite considerably. For example, let's talk about Canada. You're a citizen of Canada as well, as I'm given to understand. Quite a number of extraordinary developments are taking place. Canada is a Commonwealth nation. It is also the closest ally of the United States. And there are those who say that in this new age of reconsolidation, with the rules of the game being changed, actually there is a very strong case for Canada being somewhat part of United States. Is it a simplistic understanding of what's going on, or there is an element of truth in this outlandish proposition?
Well, Canada is a great example, and yes, my mother was born in Canada. I'm Canadian, half Canadian. President Trump would have me give up my Canadian passport. He looks at, is it Canada, Greenland, Panama, from the perspective that it could be, it should be, and if the current rules don't permit it, or if the current rules would permit it, but people aren't there yet in terms of embracing what the tools that I have right now. He looks at his job is to get everybody on board, whether with existing tools so he can do what he wants, or, as you point out, the existing tools need to be changed. And that's what he's doing. And he does it, you could say he does it on the fly, but if he comes to a wall in what he wants to do, he's going to find a way either around either side of it, above it, or below it. So he is changing the rules, the global landscape. What he's doing with tariffs is, is it within the rules, so to speak? It pretty much is. But did anyone ever expect the rules to be used to the extent and in a condensed way so quickly and with so punitively? And the answer is no. But pretty much the rules that he's using, he's allowed to use. And so that's one of the challenges that heads of state and heads of government like President Xi or President Putin or President Erdogan and others are having, which is they got a guy who is looking at his rule book, he's looking at his sanctions book, and he's got a team around him, and this is what's so critical, and he didn't have it his first term, but he's got it this term. They had 4 years out to decide what they wanted to do, and then most importantly, figure out how they were going to do it. And so they took the rule book that existed, and they implemented everything, and then they said, you got a problem with it? Go to the courts. And that's where we are. It's uncharted, but anyone that voted for him should have expected what they've got. And everyone who didn't vote for him, they're getting basically what he said he was going to do. And that's the one thing about this guy. In his first term campaigning and his second term, he basically told you what he was going to do. There were a lot of people who didn't believe he would do it, could do it, but he was going to try.
And there are two fundamental questions that many people would ask. One is, to what extent Trump's own personality will be in a position of affecting the whole generation? Will it extend beyond this surrounding or not? And second question, whether this term, second term, will have permanent consequences, because some of the analysts advising Ukrainians wait and see, maybe after 2028 things will be different. And Ukrainians feel incredibly betrayed. They feel incredibly betrayed because they were given a very clear indication that US and allies would support Ukraine up to the hilt, but that has not happened. There is some talk about 4 regions of Ukraine which are currently under Russian occupation actually being recognized as Russian controlled. Whether they will be officially Russian sovereign territories or not, it's of course another question. There is a question about America controlling that gas pipeline, and in the context of minerals deals, some Ukrainians find United States of America not so different to Russia in terms of acting as a colonial bully, as they would say. Is America behaving as a colonial bully, or still we are sort of oversimplifying things? It's just a mode of action related to a bigger picture, which still has got some virtue about it. Because I think that during the course of this conversation, when it comes to Trump's foreign policy, you earlier said that we shouldn't overanalyze what he's doing. It's very simplistic, but still, for historians, there is always the question of what is the place of this man in history textbooks, and therefore some grand ideas seem to sort of fluctuate in our minds. Therefore, I'm asking, what is the reasoning behind, even you look at the grand scheme of things? Because Trump is a product of the age. He symbolizes something bigger than himself, probably, and he's beyond those practical exigencies, perhaps.
Yeah, there's an incredible amount to unpack with your question. With Ukraine, the Ukrainians feel betrayed from the Budapest Memorandum to the Minsk Accords. They feel betrayed from 2008 during George W. Bush when Russia invaded Abkhazia and Ossetia in Georgia, and basically nothing was done. 2014, Crimea, Donbass, nothing that much is done. And they circle today, and they're basically, what are you all doing? You keep saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Well, that was the Biden administration. With the Trump administration, what we have is about Ukraine without Ukraine. And that's basically what Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, is doing during his travels to Moscow. And that's what President Trump is doing. So for the Ukrainians, what they thought was a partnership, they're now understanding, or the partnership during the Biden administration, they're understanding that during the Trump administration, they're not partners, they're a customer. And they're a customer that owes the US money and is back due on the payments. That's how Donald Trump looks at them. And so with the mineral agreement that includes now the discussion of the Gazprom pipeline and that, for the Ukrainians, it's just an act of extortion. And the Ukrainians should do whatever they can to avoid signing it. It just makes absolutely no sense, because it's not giving them anything in the future. For President Trump, all that agreement is about recouping what's already been paid. Nothing to do about the future. So for the Ukrainians, why would you pay something that you really don't have to be paying when you know that the guy that wants you to pay it has already said he's not going to be helping you really any further? So you've got to look at the Europeans. And in some respects, by walking away from it, they do force the Europeans to step up and do some more. In terms of where all that puts the U.S. in terms of its overall role and managerial role, and how the world looks at us through the spectrum of, let's say, what's happening in Ukraine. President Trump is quite smartly and quite cleanly exposing what his strategy is and exposing what he wants. And for heads of state and heads of government in other countries, particularly European Union, NATO countries, they look at this as a complete disruption to the norm. But from his standpoint, disrupting the norm, he believes, is going to make the U.S. stronger. And if it means pushing more responsibility onto financial responsibility, military responsibility, political responsibility onto Europe and NATO, then so be it. And with respect to President Putin particularly, President Trump may not get what President Trump wants, but President Trump is going to be able to pivot and reconnect and redefine what it is he did want. And whatever works, works. And if it doesn't work, he'll walk away.
And President Trump is acutely conscious of the necessity of recognizing power. He himself very powerful. He recognizes China is very powerful, and there's a competition between China and the United States. He does not recognize Europe as proper power center, as I understand. But he's also very conscious of the role played by Turkey in the Middle East. And recently, when he was with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he praised the President Erdogan, recognizing his qualities, attributes, describing him as a very smart person. It looks like that it is his understanding of Erdogan and Turkey are based on the recognition that Turkey is a very important power. It's a power with a past, and power which is actually increasing, augmenting its credentials as a future global power, currently most certainly regional power. There's also a certain degree of appreciation for President Erdogan's qualities, as I understand. In Trump's understanding worldview, what is the place of Turkey as a potential proper ally, and to what extent he is interested in this Turkey-Israel cooperation in the Middle East as a fundamental cornerstone of stability?
And To your last point, of course, Azerbaijan has hosted delegations from Israel and from Turkey with respect primarily with Syria. President Trump, and this will go, any U.S. president, they wish that they could have the powers of others. So President Trump looks at President Erdogan, President Xi, President Putin, and we look at them as authoritarian figures, for the most part, who have a strong executive authority. And most U.S. presidents would love to be able to not have to deal with the U.S. Congress, not have to deal with the U.S. Supreme Court, not have to deal with media that may not agree with them, just to sort of roll with everything they want to do. Turkey is challenging because it is a NATO member. It has Russian anti-aircraft missiles in its inventory, although not operational. It has the real estate, so involved with the Russia-Ukraine war through the Black Sea Grain Initiative that President Erdogan spearheaded, Syria, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, the movement of energy, and then issues relating to the European Union. So Turkey is pretty much the center of a lot. And all of that connects to the United States and connects to President Trump. President Erdogan is going to have a challenge at some point because President Trump is going to say, I need you to reconcile with Israel. That's going to be a huge lift for President Erdogan, particularly given that the situation in Gaza isn't getting any better. It's just getting materially worse every day. And so President Trump tries to put pressure on President Erdogan to reconnect in some way, diplomatically, commercially, with Israel, aside from Syria. That's going to be a big lift because of domestic politics with respect to President Erdogan. The other is, what is he really potentially going to get? They've got a deposit of plus $1 billion for the F-35s that the U.S. still has. But I think even President Erdogan knows eventually they'll get into the F-35 program. But then you have Syria, and you have Israel occupying the Golan Heights, which the first Trump administration basically anointed and said, we respect the realities on the ground, so Israel, you're there, so no one else agrees with us, but we're acknowledging the Golan Heights are yours. During the past months, the Israeli Defense Forces has continued to move past the Golan Heights into territory of Syria. President Erdogan would like Israel to not only get out of that territory to make Syria more whole again, but then you have the Israelis that are going to say, well, okay, that's fine, but we want Syria north, we want them out of Syria. So President Trump does like President Erdogan. There is also Trump real estate, in Turkey, which always makes it more attractive. But for President Erdogan, it's going to be more of a political lift for him and an ideological lift, because he has been the Muslim head of state that has been more vocal than anyone else. And the little sort of anecdote, last year at the UN, had an opportunity to speak to him about Israel and Gaza. And I asked him, when it's done, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay to reconstruct Gaza? And I said, well, Israel has $200+ billion in foreign reserves. The IDF destroyed it. Shouldn't they rebuild it? And he said, John, yes, you're right. They should. They won't pay a penny. Everyone else will. My taxpayers will, but the number one people are going to be your taxpayers. And so that's sort of a reality on the ground too. And I don't know how much they're going to really be able to do that's other than cosmetic at the moment, because Turkey is playing an important role in Syria, particularly with ISIS, and particularly with dealing with the Kurds and resurrecting the pipeline, Kurdistan, through. So there's a lot of that activity. The U.S. would like to get everybody out of there and send them home. but you still have some major ideological issues. I don't know if they're going to be able to overcome
Yes,
them.
of course. And talking about ideological issues, I think we managed to accomplish the fundamental task of Dialogue of Civilisations, because the whole idea here is based on discussing current affairs from the prism of global, worldwide historic developments which are beyond the scope of today. And therefore we started with a special relationship with the civilizational credentials of the United States, the way it, according to Winston Churchill, inherited the global leadership from Britain back in 1945. And then we talked about the current geopolitics. And my last question to you, John, is going to be about, still about the very premise of Dialogue of Civilization, about this civilizational element there, the power of English language. In many ways, people would say that the reason why English is a global language today is down to British Empire and the United States of America. But this is not, no one takes it for granted this will be the case all the time, in particular with the rise of China, with other competing considerations. And there's something about English language speaking countries that sets them apart. For example, I think Bernard Lewis a long time ago said that democracy is a form of government for English-speaking countries. I was sort of saying that back then, it was said back a long time ago, he referred to somebody, I think in the 1930s in Europe, only Britain was a proper democracy. France had its own problems. Italy was not the great example of democracy, to put it mildly. Germany wasn't either. Is there anything left about the English language, English-speaking world which is going to have a force to be reckoned with? We talk about Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, Britain, those 5 countries together. What is the place of this language-induced geopolitical force in our day and age?
I think you have to look at a few of the places where English is used to help sort of set the table of its dominance and its longevity. Air traffic controllers throughout the world, pilots throughout the world, any airline, they speak English no matter where they are. Ukraine, during the war, the announcements are in Ukrainian and also in English. In Russia, the trains today, Russian and English. And if you look at signage in many parts of the world, you're going to have the native language and then there's going to be English. And even though at the United Nations they have translators doing dozens and dozens of languages, the US remains the largest economic dominant power. And even if China were to overtake the US in terms of numbers, GDP, China doesn't have the massive reach that we have. So commercially, economically, politically, financially, socially, militarily, the English language is the United States, and the United States is the English language. And as much as people detest it, and they detest that, in essence, the Trump administration, the bullying, you're going to learn, and even in our immigration, Trump administration said, no more of this, you're going to learn Spanish and that, you're going to learn English. You want to take the citizenship test, you're going to know English. You want to work, you're going to go learn English. So it's not necessarily our dominance and the longevity is going to be because we're so welcomed. It's because we have so much influence and so much control. And during this presidency, so for the next little less than 4 years, this president is prepared to use whatever levers he has to make certain that everyone knows the United States of America and that we're speaking English, and it's probably in their interests to learn English. Not making a judgment whether he's right or wrong, but you just look at the trajectory of the man, and it's the American flag it's Air Force One, it's optics about just about everything, and it's speaking English. So, we're, for at least the next 4 years, behind the scenes, we're not going to be all that welcomed. But as I've said to my colleagues who have criticized President Trump's policies the last 100 days, tariffs and everything else, I said, you're criticizing him, and it may not work. And then if it doesn't work, he's restrained. But what if what he's doing does work in terms of the benefit of for the United States? What do you think he's going to be like then?
Mm-hmm. Talking about the language, it's also very important, I think, to note that although Britain is no longer a member of the European Union, the English is still dominant language. They probably will be for some considerable time to come. Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you very much indeed for your reflections, and thank you very much indeed for this very, very interesting conversation. So grateful.
Thank you, sir.
Well, that was John Kavulich, Senior Editor with Issue Insight, a man of great knowledge, no doubt, and insight, with whom we have discussed the affairs of the mighty, so to speak, the matters of great civilizational import, Donald Trump's outlandish and grandiose quest for absolute and unfettered global dominance and domination, and the strategic fate of this nation as well. The question remains if the US does still perceive itself a force for good or not. Whether it's a force for good or not is a matter for external evaluation, but deeper, more profound introspection is also of great, tantalizingly crucial significance as well. Looking forward, as one must, to welcoming you to the next episode of Dialogue of Civilizations.